It's essentially the power is essentially so essentially wanted essentially
wanted. That's essentially what essentially the
this film is essentially